Last video, I talked about the early 19th century, and in this video, I'm going to talk about the Civil War in Boone, and then I'm going to talk about various other things throughout the rest of the 19th century into the mid-20th century. This will include the World Wars, agriculture, religion, and infrastructure. Boone, North Carolina, a small city nestled in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, home to Appalachian State University. My name is Fabiano, and in this series, I'm taking a look through the history to see how Boone formed and where it's going. To properly understand how the Civil War shaped Western North Carolina, we have to look at it in terms of who in the South actually wanted to fight the war. And a lot of people in the western part of the state, they did not want to leave the Union. This didn't make them abolitionists. This didn't mean that they weren't also still incredibly racist, but they wanted to stay in the Union. And a lot of this, especially in, Boone, in the rest of Watauga County, a lot of these people had pretty much no economic ties to the rest of the Confederacy. So a lot of, the normal standard pioneers who just lived up here and had their farms, they didn't care. They wanted to stay in the Union. But then you have elite or ruling class of Boone. Those were the ones who did want to secede because their economics were tied to the rest of the state, which is inherently tied to slavery, which means basically in Watauga County and in a lot of the mountains, it boiled down to the rich people with economic ties to the rest of the state wanted to secede, and they supported the Confederacy, and then the people with little economic ties, whether they farmed on their own or whether they just personally worked for someone else, they didn't really care, and a lot of them wanted to stay in the Union. There was a raid in Boone led by Union General George Stoneman. It was part of his broader campaign to bring the Union Army through North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, and in Boone, it was just one of the stops. So you had a bunch of troops, Union troops, under the command of Captain Miles Walter Keogh, who is a distant, great uncle of mine, so it's fascinating. They skirmished with the people of Boone, and this was on March 28th, 1865. So again, this was in the last month of the war. This was not a battle. This was nothing really big. A couple of people got injured, a couple of people died, but it was basically just some soldiers on King Street and then some Boone residents on King Street with guns, and then they fought right there, and that was pretty much it. This was not a battle, and besides that, Watauga County and Boone didn't really play a role in the Civil War besides just, sending out soldiers, right? Sending out young men who volunteered in the army. That's pretty much the only thing that they did. And then you also have the lumber industry, farming and agriculture, but still very, 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 very low contribution to the war. After the war, North Carolina fell into the hands of Union military rule. Of course, they're not gonna just give them back their home rule, except President Johnson was very, very much adamant on just letting them do what they want to do. So you had a Republican governor, W.W. Holden, who had power in 1868, and then that basically stayed steady until about 1870, and then in 1870, the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacy rose to power in the state of North Carolina, basically overturned all of the progress that the Republican government made in North Carolina. And then again with the national election of 1876 and Rutherford Hayes defeating Samuel Tilden, all of that national news, basically, they pulled the federal troops out of the South. African Americans stopped voting because of all of the intimidation tactics, and de jure discrimination, Jim Crow laws basically took so much effect in the South. It happened a lot in Watauga County, although Boone and Watauga County's minority black populations, they're a lot lower than the rest of North Carolina is, especially near the eastern part of the state and near Wilmington. But there still was a sizable community. And this is around when the town of Boone officially became an incorporated town by the General Assembly. It had been the county seat of Watauga County since about 1849, since the county was created. January 23rd, 1872, that's when the General Assembly approved that Boone would be a new town, and their first mayor was W.L. Bryan. But around this time, the town still had like, you know, a couple hundred people at most. And again, in that couple hundred people that lived in Boone, there was an African American community here. It was just a lot less in terms of percentage compared to the rest of the state, especially near the east. The most notable example of this is the Junaluska community. So this formed around the base of Howard's Knob around 1898, but it had a way longer historical past. It was basically any freed African Americans or any enslaved people that ran away, they ran to here, they formed their communities, and especially after the Civil War, it really took shape. And this land was historically where slave quarters for one of Boone's like big, like important families were held. So once, you know, the slaves got freed, they just stayed there in their same quarters. And it might be a bit, you know, different than that. They might have moved out the house, but it's pretty much the same area. And there's a historical marker today that stands in Boone. It was erected in 2021, where pretty much the community was, and it kind of still is there. It's just, again, it's been 100 years. People have moved, new people come in and everything like that. This community had their churches, they had schools, they had all of, you know, the things that a community needs, residences and everything like that. Church in Watauga County was basically the same as anywhere else in North Carolina, or really just America as a whole. You had first churches that were basically just schoolhouses for the kids, but they were also churches because it all blended together. Basically played a heavy part in basically their lives, everyone's lives, and it was that way in Watauga County. It was that way in pretty much every county in America at the time. The next thing I'm going to do is just list off a bunch of different types of churches and then when they were first founded in either Boone or in the near area. So the first one is the Presbyterian Church. This was founded in Blowing Rock in about 1886. Next we have the Lutheran Church. The first congregation was made in about 1845. They had a building that was finally built in 1866. I don't know why it took 21 years for them to get a building. And then there also had the Mount Zion Church, which built in 1876. The next church is the Evangelical Church. This opened up around 1915 in Blowing Rock. However, there was not a lot of membership, not a lot of people joined, and eventually it kind of merged with the Presbyterian Church. They still had different beliefs, but the church itself just couldn't keep going with barely any members. Next is the Episcopalian Church. This started in Valley Crucis around the Watauga River around I think it was 1865. This church was associated with the school there. However, a lot of churches were associated with schools, but this one specifically was in a school practically. And the last one is the Advent Church. I believe this is the one with the Seventh-day Adventists and everything, but I don't know enough about the Christian denominations. This one, they organized in around 1922 in Boone, and their church building got built in around 1925. In this section, I'm obviously going to talk about agriculture. However, there is just so much detail about pretty much every niche subject, not just in Watauga County, but in all of North Carolina. And I really don't feel like getting super into that. I'm not going to just list off just a bunch of just random crops that don't really matter. So I'm going to kind of just try to scrape the surface and get the themes out of it. The first big theme is that farming and agriculture is way older than Watauga County. And this is pretty obvious. Native Americans obviously farmed and grew their own crops way before Europeans arrived. I talked about that in the first video of the series. One of the techniques that is actually interesting is how farmers would clear the forests to make their fields. Obviously, the first thing, you want to take up all the dead leaves and everything like that, and they'd burn it in a controlled forest fire. And then they would do a process called girdling. And the process is basically you take cuts around the outer edge of the bark. You penetrate it about an inch or more thick into the wood. Make sure, get all the sap and everything like that. And then you just leave it. And then the wood will eventually die on its own and it'll fall, and you don't have to do all that manual labor to cut down the tree. And the big part about this is that it took a bunch of time, but it was super, advantageous because one, you didn't have to do all of that labor yourself. And then two, when the tree fell, the wood was already dead. So instead of hauling away, a live wood, it's a lot easier to haul away dead wood because it's so much lighter. As Watauga County evolved from the Revolution into the 20th century, farming and methods and everything like that evolved too. We now had manufacturing plants where they took crops and they turned them into things. One of the biggest ones, there was a sauerkraut plant in Boone. And I remember that my professor literally said that at App State, for about like 30 years, it would smell like sauerkraut all day, every day, because there was a sauerkraut plant right there on downtown Boone. And I would genuinely lose my mind if that was the case now. I hate the smell of sauerkraut. There was also the Appalachian Evergreen Company. Again, a bunch of lumber in this area. They grew Christmas trees up here. You also had amazing pastures for grazing for cows and sheep and everything like that. You know, not where it's mountainous, but just in the big open pastures, like around Deep Gap kind of. And then the leading crop of Watauga County was actually the potato. I don't know why I'm trying to hold a potato here, but the potato, again, was the leading crop. It was mainly for subsistence, and then around after World War I, they started really growing it for commercial and market use. They also had cabbage, you know, for sauerkraut. They had tobacco, of course. It's what, you know, a lot of the South is known for. They didn't have any cotton because it doesn't really grow out here. And they had cows and sheep, you know, which produces milk and wool respectively, and they used all of that stuff. They would bring it into markets. Again, the markets would not be up in Boone. The markets would be farther down into the Piedmont, especially, you know, Morganton, Hickory, and if they really wanted to travel, they'd go all the way to Charlotte. But a lot of the times they would bring their stuff off the mountain into, you know, Morganton, Hickory, somewhere close like that, or even to Asheville. In the early 20th century, Boone had around 400 people, and this was in 1915. And these people, again, there's only a certain point where pioneer living and gravel roads can suffice. So over time, the state government of North Carolina would build roads in these places. They built roads that connected the places to the rest of the state, especially, you know, later in the 1950s, they eventually built the highways, you know, like State Highway 321, 421, those are the big ones. You have 77 and 485 and 85 and all that stuff. I'm not just gonna keep listing highway numbers though. But the biggest thing is that these counties, Watauga County, Ashe County, Allegheny County, and Avery County, they were considered the lost provinces. And this is, you know, because a lot of the bulk of their trading, a lot of the bulk of their economies that they would do was with the state of Tennessee and not the rest of North Carolina, right? And it makes sense. Why would I in Boone and in Watauga County bring my crops so far into the rest of the state when I can just cross right over into Tennessee and sell them right there in Knoxville? And this was even exacerbated by the railroad, Tweetsie Railroad, that ran between Johnson City and Boone. There was no railroad between Boone and the rest of the state. You had to go from Boone to Johnson City all the way down to Asheville, and then you could get to the rest of the state. So it doesn't make sense for these counties to trade with North Carolina when they could so much easier trade with Tennessee. World War I and World War II in, 1910s and the 1940s had a large impact on all of North Carolina and America as a whole. I'm learning about that right now in my class, but in Watauga County specifically, and I guess kind of the rest of the mountains, the impact was less, manufacturing and jobs and everything like that, but it was more psychological. It was more social. You had these people who they lived in the mountains, and the mountains, sometimes they can feel like a prison. So here's this quote from one of the books that I used for research on these videos. It says that the boys called into service, they gained a breadth of vision within 4 or 5 years that would have required many years of public education to accomplish. If the people of Watauga were once provincial, that day is gone forever. Thus, the spirit of spiritual isolation, like physical isolation, is no more. This just goes to show that there was a massive psychological change within the minds of the people in Watauga County. They had 270 soldiers from Watauga County go fight in World War I, with 20 of them dying. And then in World War II, they had 2,200 soldiers from Watauga County going to fight, and only 63 of them died. So that is like 2,100 soldiers coming back from World War II with new experiences. And I know not all of them would go to these places. A lot of them would stay in training in America. But you have at least well over 1,000 soldiers that went to other nations like France and Germany, coming back and seeing, oh, we could do this better, we can do this better, and that ignited a spirit of change within the minds of the people. And it wasn't, just social change, and a lot of times it wasn't social change at all. It was infrastructure, business, markets, right? Why would we continue to just live for sustenance farming like we have been, when now we can, make money by selling our lumber, selling our sauerkraut, for example, right, to the rest of the state. So that's pretty much it for this video. This one was a lot more kind of all over the place than all of the other 5 parts are going to be. The next video is going to be specifically about disasters, about flooding. It's been a big part, especially recently, if you've ever heard the news about Hurricane Helene. So that's what I'm going to talk about in the next video. But this video, the large theme is that the social change in Watauga County was brought about, after the war, after the Civil War, after the World Wars, but a lot of it followed national trends. Boone specifically didn't stick out. They didn't do anything like themselves. Yes, they had their, their industries, cabbage, lumber, right? But they didn't have their specific moment. Boone has just kind of been in the background for a lot of history, and that's pretty much how it's been. Again, from the lost provinces to where it is now, Boone and the rest of the Western North Carolina is here. People do know about it, but again, it's not necessarily at the front of their minds. We can see that now. With Hurricane Helene, it destroyed a lot of towns, a lot of homes, and the effort to fix that, yes, it was, swift, and yes, people took action, but now that it's, really time to implement the action, the state government of North Carolina is really dragging their feet. And if that type of disaster happened to, Charlotte or Raleigh, they would have acted by now. They would have fixed it by now. But Boone, Banner Elk, Western North Carolina, even Asheville, to this day, there are still roads that are closed from the hurricane last fall. And I don't want to do too much foreshadowing into the next part, but you can see how, this lost province mentality of the region is still kind of there. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. And as always, I hope you have a great day.